Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt slave serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm a useful idiot. Welcome. And today I want to talk about election fraud. And the big story, which came out last week, is 2,500 fraudulent voter registration forms popped up in Pennsylvania, Lancashire County. And this story continues to evolve because apparently 3,000 more showed up in York County, and there's a third county under investigation as well. And so that's three counties out of the entire state of Pennsylvania, and there's probably going to end up being these kind of fraudulent voter registration forms popping up in all the counties across Pennsylvania. And there's also these stories. I did one video already about voter machines flipping votes, and this has showed up in Tennessee and Texas and Pennsylvania. And I'll attach below a video that popped up in Kentucky as well. And this one's great because it shows the actual screen. The guy is trying to vote for Trump, and the vote won't take, and it just keeps flipping back to Harris Waltz. So these are examples of voter fraud that's happening. And there's also all these incidents here in Washington State. There's been these ballot boxes being burn up, and there's also another story that came out about a postman that was caught destroying ballots. And there's also just random incidents like this happening across the country now. And I just think it's interesting to me because there's voter fraud, and the politicians and the media has continued to deny election after election that there's any voter fraud. And the fact that they tell you, the politicians and the media are telling you there's no voter fraud, is your first clue that, yeah, there's voter fraud. If they say there isn't, then there is. And we have plenty of examples stretching back election after election after election. And they start to add up to real numbers. You look at these voter registration forms in Pennsylvania, 3,000 in one county, 3,000 in another county. Pretty soon they start adding up to real numbers. And looking back over the last election in 2020, all 49 states have done audits of their votes cast in 2020, and there's a lot of anomalies in all the states. So let's accept that election fraud is a reality. And I've said many times before, anything that involves power and money, then anything can happen. And this is true in this case as well. And I think it's also interesting that these fake voter registration forms that are popping up in Pennsylvania are being traced back to a media company in Arizona. So this looks like an organized effort. And that brings up a good point for me, and that's the fact that there's different kinds of election fraud. There's lone zealots, election officials, postmen, anybody involved in the election process that are just lone zealots who are trying to influence the election with their single little efforts. And then there's another kind of election fraud which is done on a larger scale that's organized. And so I think it's important to make a distinction between those two types of election fraud. And of course, when these voter machines are having problems, which they've had in 2020 and 2016 and before, ever since they started using voter machines, we've seen these vote flipping things happen over and over and over again. So that's a sign of a more organized effort that's coming from the top. And it brings to mind for me the famous quote by Stalin: doesn't matter who votes, it matters who counts the votes. And that's another problem we have when we have a DNC and a GOP we can't trust, and we have the government basically in charge of certifying elections. There's a problem right there. Our government is so ladled with corruption and misinformation when they say that they're not involved in voter fraud. Once again, that's our clue that we are involved in voter fraud. And there's these media denials which came out immediately when the Lancashire events happened. And so the media immediately comes out and says, no, there's no voter fraud, it's a conspiracy theory. But I assure you it's a fact. And I also think that the act of certification is a really important part of this. In fact, Georgia enacted a law that when the election ends, that the votes immediately be certified, because once they're certified, it's over. And that ties in with the events of January 6th as well. Trump wasn't trying to interrupt the transition of power. He wasn't trying to overtake the American government. He wasn't trying to instigate a coup. He merely wanted to have certification halted or slowed down so that some of these accusations of voter fraud could be looked at. And that's very legitimate. So, but once again, it's all politicized, and it becomes this whole idea about election denying. And that's another really important part of this whole thing, this whole idea of election denying. And with the efforts of the politicians and the media to label Trump an election denier, um, first of all, he has the legitimate right to do so. But the other part of that, of course, is that Hillary Clinton lost, and she's been denying the election, and the liberal base goes along with the fact that they assume that she won. So it's all right for the left to go into election denying, and that was true of a lot of regional candidates as well that lost and then said that they won. And I also have to remind you, historically, that's nothing really new. If you look back in history, Andrew Jackson there was an issue when Andrew Jackson was elected president, and he won the popular vote. And nobody calls him an election denier when he wanted to have it looked into. And so anyway, I just think it's really interesting. And there's a lot of ways that elections can be screwed with too, as I've mentioned before. Dead people are registered. There's fake addresses, fake signatures, like the case in Pennsylvania with these registration forms. There's all kinds of ways these voting machines can be hacked, and we see that actively election after election. And then the whole problem too that's been unleashed when mail-in ballots used to be just a portion of election cycles, and now they're the focal point. They instigated it during the COVID that everyone could send in mail ballots, and now it's just the standard of the system. And it's really easy when you have mail-in ballots to do all kinds of monkey fucking with the system. One example of that is ballot harvesting. In fact, there's another video that just came out recently. The man was caught on camera stuffing a ballot box with about 500 ballots. And ballot harvesting is a lot of the ballots are stolen and filled out and then put in ballot boxes. But another way is intimidation of people and getting their ballots. And another way is just to go out and buy them. There's a case in Michigan, I believe, that people, heavily documented, people just go out and go door to door and buy ballots from people and then go fill out their desired candidate. Then another layer we have a problem with election fraud too is the fact that now we have illegals voting, and I did a whole video on that, so I won't go into it too much here. But the fact that illegals are getting to vote, and there's a lot of powers to be, particularly with the Democratic Party, that are making it very difficult to not have illegals vote, and they've made it very easy for them to vote. There was another story that came out recently where a bunch of people, citizens, had been lined up at a voting office, and a couple of buses rolled up, and a bunch of illegals came out with their translators and walked to the front of the line and went in to vote, and very obviously illegal. So very, very complicated. But I just think people got to get used to the idea that, like I've already said, it's power and money involved, and all bets are off, and everything's fair in love and war when it comes to elections and power and money. And there is election fraud. I don't care how much the politicians deny it. I don't care how much the media denies it and calls it conspiracy theory. There is, in fact, voter fraud. The only question is how much. Is there enough voter fraud to turn an election? Well, possibly, as I've mentioned before, in the last election, Biden theoretically won Georgia by a mere 11,000 votes. So if you take Pennsylvania, for example, if they have these voter registration forms and fake votes coming in at 3,000 per county, it only takes 3 or 4 counties to add up to over 11,000 votes, and that could sway the state. So be prepared. This election, particularly, because it's so important, because it's so dramatic, because the stakes are so high, and because corruption is at an all-time high. I think the likelihood of it just being a national clusterfuck, sorting out what kind of voter fraud there was and how much there was. So it's going to be a slow process on election night, and we're going to see a lot of fireworks, and the media is going to be going crazy. The liberal and conservative bases are going to be going crazy, and the politicians are going to be going crazy. So prepare yourself. But anyway, I guess that's the bottom line here. Election fraud is not a conspiracy theory. It's a reality, and anybody that doesn't think so is pretty naive. I'm a useful idiot, don't you be one too?